What dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why Mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant, and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him, so he was legally my uncle. My aunt was a real piece of work. To backtrack a moment, this side of my family isn't biological. Technically my dad is my stepdad, but he raised me from toddlerhood and he's my dad, pure and simple. All of his family treated me as one of their own. Except my aunt. She would always tell my grandparents that she just couldn't understand how they could love me, because I wasn't blood family. I have no idea why she didn't want her son back. It was a familial kidnapping, non-custodial father. When my cousin was returned, she ditched him with my grandparents and got back together with her other half. When I was a teenager, my grandma called my dad, crying. My aunt was doing some digging and discovered she and my dad were adopted. I'm not defending this, but it was the 1950s and in another country. Not disclosing an adoption wasn't unusual at the time. My aunt threatened to tell my dad, so my grandma called and said they were adopted. My dad's reaction was literally, "So?" My aunt never spoke to my grandparents again, and my cousin turned out exactly like her. And so, all those years of not liking me because I'm not blood backfired, because she isn't blood either. I'm glad that has never mattered to me. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist. Poor Aunt Gloria. Just wants to be a nudie lady and everyone acts like she's a leper." My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise. Took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had the life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day Uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was floored. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her rages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption, as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. 1. My grandfather killed his own son by throwing him on the floor because he was crying. He was just a couple months old. 2. My uncle tried to rob a bank and ran away by foot. He later on got married and his wife ended up committing suicide. At the time the police thought that my uncle killed her, since he had a criminal past, but he didn't. He was at work and there were witnesses. 3. I have multiple half-siblings. My dad is unfaithful. 4. My grandfather burnt the house down with his wife and children inside with the intention of them dying. My grandmother ran away with her 7 or 8 children, I don't recall, and she asked a priest, that she worked for, I think she cleaned his house, to give her a space to stay. He ended up giving her a home that a old lady left for the church, and if I'm not mistaken she was paying it little by little. 5. My aunt's neighbor, who I went to the beach with when I was little, apparently killed his own wife abroad. 6. There was a rumor that my uncle's kids weren't his. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14, from a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. My mother grew up in the American South. Her brother died in his early 20s and she always told me it was a freak accident. A bullet came through the window killing him. They lived in a rural area so I never questioned it. One year, I inherited an old Korean War officer's sword after my grandpa passed. My mom freaked out and told me that it was too dangerous to keep and that we should sell it or get a safe to lock it up in. I thought it was weird so I asked my dad and he got this sad look on his face. Turns out my mom's brother was brutally murdered with a similar sword in the 80s. He had gotten involved with some drug dealers and they thought he had snitched about one of their big deals that got busted. No idea why they decided to use a sword, but it was pretty fucked up to hear about. My mom had to ID the body. I found this out when I was 16 but she never directly acknowledged it until years later. My mom said he was just trying to make some extra cash by introducing people who partied to the dealers. I'm about his age now and I can see how he just thought he was making a quick buck. Never thinking something like that would get him killed. That my biological mother used to give me heroin and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share, so I'd go through withdrawals but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer, she lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. My grandfather had severely scarred legs from burns he got as a kid. Growing up we were told that he was in a fire in an apartment building and sustained the burns while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great-aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. great-grandfather was an abusive alcoholic piece of shit who fucking maimed his son. Here's a family story I refer to as the accident. For years my older sister's bio dad died in an accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident, it was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30-some years and my sister deals with a fuckload of mental issues, and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think Motor Norman Rockwell style all-out meal but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a shitty teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head and absolutely screams, "Yeah? Your fucking child molester dad blew his fucking head off. He never had to deal with your bullshit." And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't till after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have fucking loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter the mother had a mental breakdown not longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL. My older sister is not my full sister, she's my half-sister via my mother. My mother was married before and had my sister with her first husband. Her first husband raped my sister from when she was 2 or 3 years old. My mother caught him assaulting my sister, but no one believed her and my sister was, from what I was told, fucked up. My mother divorced him and he tried to get custody of my sister, so she ran away with my sister, even cutting contact with her own family to keep my sister safe. A few years later she met my dad, who unofficially adopted my sister, and they had me. I grew up not knowing because my sister thought I might not love her the same if I knew we had different dads, and I think maybe some part of her wanted to forget her stepdad isn't really her biological dad. The only reason I ever found out, I found out when I was 20, is because somehow, my sister's biological grandmother found my mother's address and called. I answered the phone and she mistook me for my sister. That was an interesting phone call and afternoon. Why the neighbors moved, trigger warning for violent crime. I was pretty young when this happened, so the details won't be perfect, but the story is otherwise true. I grew up in a coastal town and we had some neighbors whom I really liked. My parents were friends with them, their kids were roughly my age. Wonderful. We played together all the time. One day they very suddenly moved. I was a bit confused as there had been no clue that they were going. I remember some police cars and the moving vans weeks later, but that was it. My mother told me that the kid's grandmother had become very ill. The cops came to tell the family, and they left emergently to care for her and never came back. I was only about 5. Seemed legit. Many years later, as an adult, and long since moved away from that area, my parents and I were reminiscing over our old home. I mentioned that I wondered whatever happened to them. That's when my mom told me the truth. The parents had gone out that night on a date and left the kids with a 14-year-old babysitter. When they returned home they found the sitter murdered. Someone had broken into the home and then killed the sitter. My mom stated the cops think the sitter pretended to be the only one home to protect the kids. When the parents got home they checked the kids were safe and set them back to sleep. The police obviously immediately came. Once the kids were hard asleep the parents picked them up, put blankets over their heads, asked the cops to be silent as they walked them out, and took them out of the house. They gave the kids the same story my parents told me. Grandma was sick and they were going to live with her. Grandma dutifully played along with the ruse for several weeks until the parents could find a new home to live in. The kids were kept unaware of what had happened just mere feet from them as they didn't want the kids to be forever terrified of it happening again. Not sure if the kids ever eventually figured out the truth of that one. When I turned 21, my grandfather told me a story about his older brother that I had never heard. My great-uncle was a big boozer for most of his life. He passed at 92 and by then had switched from liquor to beer and wine. He also cut down to 1 pack of cigarettes a day instead of 2 after he had half a lung removed. Pap and my uncle grew up on a farm in the 30s and 40s. Mostly the family ran the farm by themselves, but from time to time they would hire drifters on as farmhands. In 1950, my uncle and one of the farmhands were out drinking and they were driving back to the farm in my uncle's convertible. My uncle was the one driving and he misjudged a turn that had a steep bank on the right side. He ran the car up the embankment, which was steep enough to flip it. My uncle was thrown from the car, but the farmhand he was drinking with was only halfway out of the car when it landed. Pap said he was severed clean into 2 pieces. Because the farmhand was just a drifter without any family to make much fuss and because the Korean War had just started, my uncle was able to enlist and avoid any criminal charges. He was in Korea until the end of the war. That was the only time I've ever heard that story told, and although I would never be someone who has more than a few drinks before getting behind the wheel, it's something that definitely sticks in my mind. And it's a story I'll tell my own kids when they get their license. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and they live a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3 to 4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. 1. My paternal great-grandmother was owned by a wealthy cattle ranch around the turn of the last century on the Mexico-Texas border in the 1890s/1900s-ish. She didn't leave the ranch until she was 16 when she got pregnant and ran away because the baby belonged to the owner of the ranch and she thought he'd kill her if he found out. It was strange to learn that the old lady that would hold me and sing to me as a kid spent the first decade and a half of her life as property. I wasn't told any of this until after my grandmother, her daughter, passed away. My great-grandmother was very ashamed of her past and I think by extension so was my grandmother. Looking at old photos of my grandmother and her older brother, the baby she had at 16, he does look strikingly more European than my grandmother, an indigenous Mexican. 2. My maternal grandfather was a pedophile and harmed my mother and her siblings. It was a well-known secret in the family, which is even more disgusting. Growing up I used to spend the night at my dad's parents' house all the time, but I don't have a single memory of spending the night at my mom's parents' house. Never once sat on his lap. Never once did my mom ever allow him to hug us. I never understood why my mom was so cold to him when my father was so close with his own father. I grew up resenting my mom for withholding us from a whole other set of grandparents and wished she would have told us sooner than when she finally did. I would have had more sympathy for her. Growing up I always knew my parents had marital issues, constant fighting. A couple times Dad disappeared for a few days living in his car, issues with drinking. But they stayed together, and when I asked why didn't they divorce, they always said they loved each other too much, and in the past few years, things seem to have gotten better. My parents in fact are now so comfortable in their relationship that they make jokes about all the awful stuff they've done to each other in front of me. What I've managed to put together is, my parents met when they were 14 and my mother was dating an 18-year-old, and my dad would relentlessly ask her out until she eventually dumped her boyfriend for my dad. My mother went on to university after college, we're UK, whereas my dad dropped out of college and went straight into work while constantly drinking and partying. It was at one of these parties, while my mum was studying, that he cheated on my mum with someone from their old secondary school, so she dumps him. Barely a year later my dad realizes he doesn't know how to do anything for himself, no one else wants him, and he goes crawling back to my mum. She agrees to take him back, but only if he marries her, not immediately but eventually, she said. He agrees, and a short year after that, aged 22 now, she's already pressuring him to propose. He fumbles it frankly, we're in Paris, but forgot the ring and proposed back in the hotel room after they'd visited the Eiffel Tower that day, which was her dream proposal, but she says yes. A month after they're married, mum pressures him into having a child that he doesn't want, and 9 months later I was born. They soon realize how hard having a child is and basically pawn me off on my grandparents for the rest of my childhood. After me there were 2 more accidental babies, and each time my dad threatened to leave her if she didn't abort them. She managed to convince him to stay while keeping my siblings by promising he wouldn't have to raise them. He didn't, but neither did she. Frankly, I did. And that is only what happened before/shortly after I was born. If I carried on into my childhood, we'd be here for years. What they sold to me as the perfect love story, been together since they were 14, proposed in Paris, soon married and had children because of pure love, is in fact a bunch of skewered half-truths from a horrible twisted love map of my mother's manipulation and my father disappointing her time and time again. We've reached the end of the video once again. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to get notified whenever my next video drops, make sure to subscribe. I'm posting once or twice a week. Also let me know your thoughts on the stories. Until next time.